So this is a website for a video shop. No, it's not a video shop, is it? It's a bike shop. There aren't any video shops anymore. The idea is you can browse the contents of the catalogue. You can pick a particular type of bike, and it follows the basic principle of a bike shop that when you buy one, it goes into a shopping basket, and it will be possible to buy more than one. So that seems a bit strange, to be putting bicycles into a basket. So this is a software product, isn't it, this website? And the question is, would this be good as a product, as the product for a particular project? Or is there something about it that makes it somehow inadequate? Right, well, the answer to the question of whether this is enough is a complicated one. It might be that using frameworks of various types, you'd be able to create a website like that in a way that is a little bit too easy for it to count as technically complicated. But say we just switch that case study around a little bit and made the things that are being sold books, and say we were talking about students selling textbooks that they no longer needed to students behind them, the year behind them. So you are a student who bought a load of textbooks, you had them for a year, you finished the modules that required you to have those textbooks, now you've got them, they were very expensive, here's a chance to recoup the cost by selling them to students who are just starting on the second year as you proceed into the final year. So that would be a shop, a bookshop, wouldn't it? Could look like that. But you might want to then build in some auction type functionality so that students could upload a book and then other students could bid for it. And then you start to get into the area of something that is technically more complicated and has a customer or a client who's available, you can talk to students about whether they would find such a thing useful and get them to help you evaluate it. So it sounds like that kind of thing could be a good project. But what about this academic worthiness question? Is a project like that likely to be academically worthy? So let's just think about what we mean by academic worthiness. It's that you have to be able to present a literature review. So there'll be a bibliography at the end of your project report, and the things in the bibliography should be papers that have appeared in academic journals. And then there'll be a chapter in your report in which you discuss things that have appeared in those academic journals and how they relate to your project. So what relates to a project that is basically the design of an e-shop? Well, there are a few things I could suggest. One is usability. There's all sorts of publications in academic journals about how to make websites more usable, and you could draw on that literature in your literature review, provided that then when you built the product, you pointed out how you followed the guidelines and the ideas that you'd read about in those papers. We also like to make our websites responsive, meaning it looks different if you're working with it on a mobile phone or on a desktop machine or a laptop or a tablet. So that's a relatively new idea. We've only really talked about responsive design for 5 or 6 years. So certainly journal articles from 4 or 5 years ago would discuss ways of making websites responsive. So dip into that literature and then use your findings from researching that literature to inform the way you designed the website, so perhaps you made it responsive. You may have done this by simply using a front-end framework like Bootstrap to build the interface. But that's the kind of thing that you would find being discussed in those journal articles that you need to find for your bibliography. Similarly, what about the idea of the development method that you will follow? People nowadays like to talk about agility, agile methods for designing software. In earlier days, we talked about the waterfall model, the spiral model of software development. Now we tend to talk about agile approaches. Sometimes you talk about sustainable software, but when we talk about sustainable software, you're talking about something that is discussed in the research literature. So if you wanted to say, I'm interested in designing using an agile method with a focus on making a sustainable approach, which you may decide that isn't something you want to focus on. But in terms of just talking about an agile approach, plenty has been written about that. So, for example, if I go into Google Scholar and I put in a query like, how do I design reusable websites? Then a number of papers pop up. So here's one, defining the criteria for effective interaction design. Now that sounds like a good paper to me. I'm imagining that if this contains criteria, say there are 10 criteria to talk about effective interaction design, I could cite this paper, mention the 10 criteria, and then when I built the product, I could show that I'd followed each of those criteria. And maybe, if there's 10, maybe only 5 of them are appropriate to a shop. So I'd explain only these 5 are relevant, but look, I've paid attention to them all. Thereby connecting the design to the background research, which is making the project academically worthy. Oh, but wait a minute! I've just noticed that this paper was published in 1996. That's too long ago. The issues in effective interaction design that were relevant then probably aren't relevant now. Luckily, there's something here about the people who've cited this paper in their own papers. 481 people have written papers and cited this one. So they must have thought, these people who wrote these papers, must have thought that the one that I was looking at was relevant to what they had to say. Now, this top one here was published in 2006, talking about the research agenda. So that's kind of a literature review in itself. And then, scrolling down, some of these titles look quite promising to me. Maybe I'd start to have a look at some of those, the ones that have been published more recently. If I go back to the original, I could also have picked related articles, and then these are papers that in some way are similar in content and concepts to the paper that I liked. How have they done that? I think the way they've done it is they've taken the abstract to the paper and submitted it as a query to the search engine, so that you retrieve papers that are like this one, the one that you chose. And that would explain why the paper itself appears at the top. Building blocks of experience, understanding experience in interactive systems. That one that we've seen before. Anyway, some of these are likely to be of interest. I'm kind of interested in this one here, pattern languages in interaction design. What's a pattern language? Maybe I just don't know. And there's a paper there I could read, maybe, to explain the concepts to me. Or, I might, what I might do is go into Google, go into here and just type patterns for user interface design, something like that, to find out what this subject is all about. There's a few interesting things. Design tools, design interfaces. This website here, and I guess this one here that says 10 great sites for design patterns. look very interesting to me. I'll go back to that one. So what I'm looking at here is a website with links to various topics, and then for each topic I'm presented with a list of patterns that help me design usable websites. So I'll pick this progressive disclosure to see an example of a pattern. Well, this makes sense to me. What the pattern is saying is, don't clutter the screen up with too much information. So progressive disclosure seems to be, in this case, where it's a discussion forum, I post a comment. If you react to it, people might react to your reaction. So when I'm viewing the thread and I can see the various messages that have been posted, it would be useful if I could hide all these responses. And maybe, I could close them down at this level and just see these responses, or open them up. But basically, the design of this screen is to hide all this detail unless someone clicks on it, and then they can go lower and lower down. So that's the way that these things work. They often sort of give you an explanation of how that might be implemented, and sometimes they'll give you other examples. Now, there are quite a few of these pattern catalogues. It's interesting to compare the patterns in one library with another. Here, for example, is a pattern for autocomplete. So you'll be familiar with this. When you start to type a query into Google, suddenly, and only in the last 4 or 5 years, it starts to suggest to you what you might be about to ask. It anticipates here what your query might be, based on, I think, what other people have been asking in the past. It's we give another example of one here for booking a flight, and the drop-down list that would appear of all the destinations you could go to, and a little bit of an indication here about how you might go about implementing that pattern. Okay, so you would think, doesn't seem unreasonable to me to think that when I was in Google Scholar, I found it useful to, and I go back in here again, I'm going to pick information seeking behavior of students now, and I found that useful, following a link of citations, and I found that related articles link useful to find articles that have used similar words and language to the paper that I've liked. There's 2 user interface patterns there. One about following citations, one about finding related articles. They're not documented in any of the pattern libraries, but actually it would be quite a useful idea, really, if they were, I think. So let's just say a couple of things here. I think I've identified a number of possible project ideas. The first one was an e-shop and research into how to make the website usable and responsive, and thoughts on the method that you might use to develop the website. I would imagine putting the emphasis on using an agile method. Then I stumbled on this idea of patterns. Now, this suggests another project to me, in which the product isn't a website, the product is a collection of patterns that you have created yourself. Right, so one of them might be the pattern about following citation links. Another might be the pattern about finding related articles. It may be that if you're thinking about allowing, like it's a library system really, this, isn't it? Allowing people to search through scholarly materials, you'd look for patterns in other systems. So in the ACM search engine, there's this interface, where if I'm interested in interaction design, I'd probably decide it was to do with human-centered computing, and then there it is. when I go into interaction design, see there are other topics. I didn't type in a query, I just started to browse this hierarchy by clicking on different boxes. So there's a pattern there to help people do a certain kind of search. What about if I put interaction design into the query box here and do a search? I'd expect to retrieve something. There's some, and then don't know anything about these. Don't seem to me to be kind of paper I'd be interested in reading. But I'll just pretend that I like the look of this one, and show you the way this is structured. So this looks nothing like Google Scholar, but there is this cited link here. These are the papers that have cited that one. So I could click on one of these, and then I'd be going forward in time. These are the authors of that paper. This one has provided us with a photograph. This is information about other things that they've published. And then here's a link that would allow me to look at people with whom this lady works. These are the people with whom she has worked over the years. So these presumably have co-written papers with her, so their work might be of interest to me as well. So I'm still going to be talking about the idea of patterns here, but there seems to be a pattern for doing an author search, a pattern for doing a citation search, a pattern for browsing the index, that hierarchy of concepts. The bibliography at the end of this paper contains papers that the author put into their bibliography. I can click on these here and be taken to that paper. So that's another one. Following the reference thing is like going backwards in time. You're seeing the papers that this person who wrote the paper you're interested in cited, the ones that they had read that they found useful and interesting. So they were more or less telling you that you might find them useful and interesting too. So supposing your product was a pattern library, you should avoid producing a library of patterns that already exist. But I don't think there are very many patterns in the area of building information retrieval tools like this. So that would be different products from the website, but you could imagine prototyping that using perhaps a gallery tool for photographs. So if you have, there are various ones around out there on Flickr, Google Photos, where the idea is you have an image and some words about the image. Well, the image could be a screenshot, couldn't it? And then the words could describe the pattern. So that would be quite a good way to organize a collection of patterns. That would be another different project. Maybe also there's the idea of thinking about the design of an information seeking environment for students, say. So this is an information seeking environment for people, for students and for other researchers. It might be that you could think of a design that would be better than this. Certainly this is very different from Google Scholar, and yet they're both doing the same job. So maybe you could come up with a third interface that is different from both of them and maybe better. So that third interface, which you might storyboard using an HTML tool or even the storyboard feature in PowerPoint, or you can do that kind of thing in Visio as well, or there are other tools like Adobe Experience where you can make more sophisticated interfaces. So you could prototype an interface to an ideal information seeking environment based on patterns. Now, I'm not saying that that's a great project, but it's a clear product, it's a clear client, and there's a clear problem. The need to produce a literature review, the need to be able to write essays that cite the best references. So it's a clear product, a prototype interface, or a pattern library, or a website that is a kind of shop. Those are three very clear products. Each of them has an obvious client, and each of them would solve a problem that that client has. Each of them are academically worthy, but in the case of something like the ideal information seeking environment, the academic worthiness is sort of very, very obvious. So if you were using Google Scholar and you decided to put a query in that was information seeking behavior of students, you can see that people have written about this subject. And if I select this one here, I see that it was published in a librarianship journal. Perhaps that's not surprising. Well, who cited that one? Seems to be papers that are about young people who are familiar with social networks and what have you, and what their approach to information seeking is. So this is obviously very sort of useful thing to be reading if you're producing a literature review about how to design an information seeking environment. Alright, so the purpose of this was just to talk a bit really about the concept of academic worthiness and about the ideas that make it clear that you have thought of a good project, you've got a good project idea. You know you've got a good project idea if you can say very clearly what the product will be, who the client is, the person who would benefit from the product, and what problem you would be trying to solve. The only remaining question is whether it's academically worthy. And it will be academically worthy if you're able to produce a bibliography that contains, say, 20 research publications, that all of these would count as research publications, that are related to your project in some way. And if your website is a software product that is, say, a website for a client, say a person who has a garage and wants to be able to book cars in to be repaired and this kind of thing, the academic worthiness more or less has to come from you talking about research into how to make websites usable, how to make websites responsive, and what design methods you should follow to make sure that you're doing a good job, a professional job of thinking through the requirements before you implement anything. Well, I hope that is of some use, that discussion. Thank you for your time and for your attention.